Welcome to the Foundation Series, your deep dive into startup compensation with industry leaders from across the startup world. Join me, Matt McFarlane, a people operations leader turned compensation specialist, as we uncover the strategies and practices driving success in tech startups around the world. Hear insights from heads of people, founders, and experts as we explore how to build robust compensation frameworks that not only fuel growth and retention, but do so in the dynamic startup environment that we all know and love. Let's get into it. Welcome to the series. I feel like this has been a long time in the making, certainly from my perspective, but one of the ones I've been most excited about participating in. I think you're a man that needs no introduction, but I'm going to make you introduce yourself anyway. Please tell us a bit more about you. Tell us a bit more about your background and how you ended up where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the invite. So I definitely do need an introduction. So I'm happy to give one. So I run the insights team at Carta currently. That has been the last 3 years of building this insights practice at Carta. We can get into a little bit of what Carta does and why it's amazing. But my background is in startups, full stop. So I started a company in college. I joined as an early employee right after that to a different company. So early stage startups have been like what I've lived and breathed my whole career so far. And that part of the venture journey, going 0 to 1 or banging your head against the wall till you figure things out, that's the part that I truly love. So it's a real privilege now to be at Carta, where we sit on top of data from, close to 50,000 startups. And I get to sort of surf on top of that data to find interesting stories or narratives or help founders make better decisions, whether it's in hiring or valuations on fundraising or whatever it is. So yeah, it's been an awesome ride.
Yeah, I appreciate the intro. It's one of the reasons that I was so excited to have you on the podcast, and I mentioned this at the top, is that you sit across such a broad remit of data and insights and intelligence around how startups operate. And I think for an audience of heads of people, whether they're in the US or external, a lot of people take cues from the US around how startups operate and work. And so I think you've just got so many insights there to share. But you've been at this for a little while at Carta. Tell me, is there one kind of insight that you've sort of pulled up in the past that you just go, gosh, that is the most fascinating thing? Is there a favorite for you that you just go, maybe it's one that people rarely ask about, but it's always been so curious or really surprising for you, maybe?
That is a fantastic question. All my data points are like my children. I couldn't possibly.
Here we go.
There are, I would say, so there are two parts of our data that I didn't come in initially expecting us to have anything useful to say, but the more that I get into it, the more useful we seem to be, which the first and foremost is just compensation in general. So a couple things stand out there, like exercising equity as a startup employee. I think from the outside, it can feel like equity is one thing or another. It's either this completely useless appendage, which never turns into any money ever, or it's the reason you joined this company, right? And it's the biggest selling point and everything is dedicated around it. And of course the answer is in the middle, but I did find the stat around just the percentage of employees that ever exercise any of their equity here in the States, which is currently hovering around 30%, to be really fascinating, because it drives home this idea of startups as a bet, as a not a lottery ticket because you're working for it, but as a bet. There's an upside to it. And a lot of these things will fail. Startups are not guaranteed. In fact, most of them will go under, and that equity won't be worth anything. But when it works, it really works. The way that I like to talk to employees about this is you kind of got to think about joining an early stage startup as though you were investing into that startup, because you are, with your time and effort and money. That is how you should think about it. What is the potential of this startup to be one of the biggest companies in the world, or one of the biggest companies in this space? How do I feel about these founders navigating these challenges? You don't join because someone offers you, a little bit more cash. It's an early stage startup. You join because you're so hype about the mission and the growth and the learning that you can have there that it's really set yourself up. So if you're not passionate about joining a startup, then don't join it. It's not going to be, if you're doing it for the cash, you're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think so often I hear about people speak about it. And you're right. you shouldn't be joining for the certainly not the short term financial gain. I think always the sell for people when it comes into startups is the opportunity to create something where there wasn't something previously. And I think the learning and the growth and the rapid development that comes with that is kind of, that's the compensation in a lot of ways as well. But yeah, the premise of what you're doing and how that can change the world is certainly exciting as well. I don't know if you have this available. It's a really interesting data point, but was it 33% you said is exercised?
Yeah, before it returns to the company. So that's to be more specific, options in the US is the typical way that people get equity. Within an option, there are two criteria to turn that option into an actual unit of stock. One is vesting, so did you stay long enough? And then the other is exercise. Did you actually purchase? When you get an option, it is merely a right to purchase that stock at an agreed upon price. You don't have to do it. And as you can imagine, when the downturn in startups happens, more and more employees either leave by choice or get laid off, even worse. And then they are looking at their equity and they're going, I don't believe that's going to be worth anything, so I'm just going to let it go back to the company. I'm not going to exercise it.
Yeah. And is that 33% including companies that are being acquired or IPOing where those options are taken away?
No.
So it's just
It's just, and effectively, usually you give an option grant term of about 10 years. So a lot of this isn't a question of whether or not you stayed long enough. These are people that are leaving their jobs by choice or not by choice. And they're just faced with that moment of, okay, I've left the job. I have basically usually 90 days to make this choice. Am I going to outlay some cash for this equity, or am I just going to, let that equity go back to the company? And the majority of people right now are just letting it go back.
Yeah, interesting. Sign of the times a little bit as well, I think.
Absolutely.
Where things are at. I really wanted to dive into your intro was really insightful, in particular around that. I didn't realize you had your own startup. How cool is that? I think that kind of speaks to a persona and an experience that a lot of heads of people who tune into this are going through, which is we're starting from scratch. We've got nothing in place. Tell me a little bit about what that experience was like for you at that startup, particularly from the equity lens.
Yeah, well, we had employees when we closed down, but not many. Only a couple beyond the three founding team. I gotta be honest, man. I started a startup. I don't want to paint myself as this master of the universe founder, because what we were trying to do originally is just avoid our summer jobs that we were going to go do, and we hated it. And we wanted to build this company around music festivals. We wanted effectively to build this website and this a kind of holdco where we would do a lot of merchandising for music festivals. So that was the original idea. We spent 2 summers going around to dozens and dozens of music festivals where we sold a ton of merchandise, and we had this kind of import business. It was cool. We are actually making money, but we weren't doing the thing that we originally started to do, which was, can we build a website around basically a pitchfork for music festivals? Never really got off the ground. We sort of sold the company to a couple of close friends as we left college. But it was, incredibly instructive on things like, how do you pay sales tax in 26 states? Because that's where you've been all summer. And so in terms of working hard, that was amazing. In terms of actually learning what a technology startup does, maybe a little bit less.
So no opportunity to build and roll out an equity program for a small team like that.
Not quite. We had many debates about who should own what percentage of equity amongst the founders. That was a fun, month-long conversation, but not so much for employees.
Yeah, I'll bet. Well, speak to that dynamic, because I think that too is something that, a head of people has to help navigate. There was something the other day, and I think you might have even posted about, founder compensation, founder refreshes, things like that are quite, controversial. There's a lot of expectation around what people have there in that sense. But what are some of the key things that a head of people needs to navigate when it comes to those sorts of topics that you see crop up?
I think it is actually a really deep well of nuanced conversation. Some of the data that we've put out on it is mostly focused on how do founders split that initial equity pie before anybody else is in the business. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about that part. But once you're on the funding journey and you're going through VC capital raises, I think it's important for the head of people to realize that the founder's ownership is an incredibly material part of how they're thinking about the business, not because they necessarily have to have a specific number, just because it's in conversation with how they feel about themselves. So it becomes a very emotional thing. And it's part of the reason why a lot of founding teams end up splitting up over time is disagreements about equity, disagreements about who is responsible for what, disagreements about the future of the business. And I think that most VCs these days, at least when I'm speaking to US ones, they understand that one of the easiest ways to kill a business is to disincentivize the founder enough that they want to leave. That's a very simple way to kill a company, is to have the CEO leave because they don't feel like they have enough upside. So I don't run into that problem too much from investors. I do run into a lot of messiness around refreshes, clawbacks, reverse vesting schedules, and then distinctions between founders. If you're 3, 4, 5 years into the business, it's a growing concern, but it's not a huge hyperscaler. You know, the CPO versus the CTO versus the COO, maybe there was a 3-founder team and now it's like looking like it maybe should be 2 founders should stay and one should, like, that stuff is messy. And like the head of people has to sort of be the moderator within some of those conversations when they're invited in.
Mm. Yeah, it's be like, speaking of favorite children, I'm sure that would be like dealing with children in some respects, trying to help navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt. I mean, one of the biggest things we tell founders, early stage founders, is if you are not on a vesting schedule as a founder, you are setting yourself up and your company up to fail. Mm. One of the number one reasons that we see companies fail is that there's a disagreement amongst the founding team, and one of the founders walks away with a fully vested equity grant in a year or so, and and we call that dead equity. You cannot, as a VC, invest in a company where 40% of the cap table isn't supporting the company anymore because they walked away. It's one of the easiest ways to kill the fundability of a business.
Yeah, super interesting insight. Wow. All right. I'm keen to pivot. One of the things that I think I was, again, so excited to speak to you about on this pod is, I think a lot of heads of people, certainly ones that I speak with, kind of feel they're going it alone when it comes to, they've been tasked with establishing an equity program. Maybe they're in the US and they've got, a great resource like Carta with benchmarking and things like that. But if they're outside of that, what tend to be some of the things that you would recommend a head of people consider as they're starting to go, okay, I need to build an equity program. I want it to be all of these things. It obviously has to be incentivizing. That's the main reason we have it. Where would you suggest they start?
It's a challenging thing to get off the ground, no doubt. I think the first set of questions really comes down to, before you get into the kinds of equity and the tax, treatments and all that kind of stuff, there are philosophical questions, which is this going to be for everyone? Are we establishing an equity plan for the entirety of the company? If not, why not? And being very specific about, no, these kinds of employees will receive ownership and these kinds won't. Because I guarantee you, people will know. People will know in the company whether or not they received equity, and they will know the ones that have. So, and I'm not saying it is required that everyone receive equity. In the States, that is more and more the case, although not always. If you are not going to broaden that equity data or equity, ownership incentivizing mechanism beyond those initial employees or like top leadership or whatever, you got to be specific as to why, even if you're not going to publish that reason. The second thing is that you need to understand, or you need to maybe think about, what level of knowledge do your employees have about ownership and equity? Because I'm here to tell you, it's probably pretty minimal. Even in the States, it's pretty minimal. Before I got it, I had equity in Carta before I worked at Carta, and I didn't understand the first thing about what I actually owned. So there's a lot of education that goes into establishing an equity program, not just the pie in the sky, look how much this could be worth, but much more specific around, if you're doing this in the States, for instance, here's what a 409A valuation is. Here's what a strike price is. Here are some great resources to help you understand the decision to exercise versus not to exercise. We can help with some of that, but it doesn't actually make it salient to the employee base if the founders or company leadership is not incentivized. So that comes from the head of people for sure, but even better if they are the lever to bring the founder along. I think founders underrate their ability to become equity educators, and the value that someone feels when they say, you didn't just give me ownership, you taught me what this meant. you clearly care that I understand what this means for myself, for my family, or my financial future, there's a real halo effect that comes from that. So that would be a broad, I'll get off my soapbox here, but like that's one of the things that we deeply, deeply believe is that equity education can be an employer brand benefit, not just the simple granting of shares.
Yeah, I agree so much with that sentiment. And I think, my own experience was that having exposure to a US workforce is that it's something that's highly valued and highly expected is equity in the company. The level of understanding varies, even within a culture where it is quite a dominant, compensation vehicle.
Yep.
How do you think that's evolved in the past, 3-4 years, as companies have gone, okay, suddenly remote work is really common and our ability to hire people in other, countries.
Yeah.
How do you think that's like augmented or furthered or deepened the expectation or the need from an education perspective where now, and this is my own experience, like entering countries where people have never had equity, there's zero cultural expectation,
Yeah.
there's almost no value placed on it, and so they're just looking at the base salary. So as a founder, or as a startup rather, when you're trying to talk about that total reward opportunity, half of it's being disregarded. Like what are some of the dynamics you've seen change there in the last couple of years, or imperatives?
I think that it's definitely the case that more and more companies are having to explain the value of equity writ large, not the individual grant, but the potential of this new form of compensation. And it's interesting when you get that like estuary of a company that had been US based, now they're hiring remote teams in other countries. How do they explain to those remote teams what equity might mean? One of the things that is difficult about this moment specifically is that one of the easiest ways to talk about equity, and this is sort of basic and bland, but in the States, you can just be like, look at Facebook. Look at Airbnb. Look at these giant, or you have a friend who was like, yeah, I was part of Airbnb when it IPO'd. Oh my God, what a day. What like an amazing experience for me and my colleagues and all this stuff. And like, if you don't have that one example, so I have this theory that if and when Canva goes public, it's going to be like a major moment for the Australian ecosystem as a whole, because people can then point to it after Atlassian and say, look, like, this is real. Like if we do what we think we can do, it can become this real thing down the road. So the more examples, the better. The other way is to like try to mix the stories from the US side to the other side that you're trying to hire in. So, don't try to keep those things too separate. You want to like encourage a culture where ownership is like the general vibe around the company. It's the viewpoint. I don't think that you're going to get to the point where everyone expects equity necessarily, but the younger the business, the more nascent the startup, the more likely it is that they're going to be offering equity. So, you can sort of change that on a case by case basis.
Yeah, I really like in particular your point around, when Canva for the Australian market, one of the questions one of the areas that I was curious is like, you do see such a widespread difference in cultural expectations around it. What do you think are some of the drivers that would make something like equity more prominent in a culture? But that's a really great point, is actually, if I know someone, or I even know someone who knows someone who got, who made a decent amount of money out of it, then it starts to create this like, oh, that could be me and this could be worth something. Yeah. What do you think there are other things that, like, when you think of a nation and its startup environment, do you think there are other things that may eventually drive, the importance of equity for its people?
Yeah, I mean, some of those, say the salience of a recent example, I think is a great way to start. The other is just sort of kind of importing it a little bit from maybe some more developed or established startup cultures. So if there's a bunch of employees who have worked both for US firms and Australian firms in this case, maybe those employees come in with a different sense of expectation because they know how, Silicon Valley startups have done it, et cetera. And then, hopefully there is this bull case around remote work and the ability to hire anywhere. We've seen some very, very valuable startups in Silicon Valley, I'm thinking particularly of Deal here, start to solve this problem of how do we grant equity worldwide? How do we deal with international compensation? Carta does a lot of that work as well. So you can see it as like coming from the more developed ecosystems for venture capital and then down into places where VC is a little bit more nascent. I mean, that was true inside the States as well. You had startups 10 or 15 years ago who wouldn't offer equity. but then they started competing with Silicon Valley startups, and that's a difficult proposition to compete with on the compensation side.
Yeah. Yeah, and you speak to another really interesting point around like, back to your point around equity for all at the start of this is like a lot of these companies that are, maybe US headquartered and have employees in other locations or jurisdictions, maybe actually can't even legally offer equity. And so that's the first hurdle, which, there's some solutions for, which is great.
I mean, and that comes down to like individual country laws, like
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
places in which it is, and I sympathize with the founders here. There are probably a lot of founders who would love to grant equity, but the number of hoops you got to jump through in various different jurisdictions to do so is really, really quite high.
I mean, even just getting the tax advice. I mean, when I worked at Oyster, we had people in 70 countries, and a lot of those we couldn't offer equity in because the cost, and actually the cost not just to the business but to the individual. So if they wanted to exercise that, the cost if they did eventually sell it, like it was prohibitive, and it's I guess a barrier to entry and those sorts of things. Which kind of segues nicely to like, what are some of those challenges? If you think of options, one of the big challenges is that, it's an option to buy, which means you have to have the cash, which means, if you don't, it's a challenge. How do you see other obstacles to equity for startups, and how do you see companies help overcome them?
Yeah, so I mean, there's challenges to issuing equity that might be regulatory or tax or the way that the business climate in the individual country is set up. And then there's challenge to making that equity liquid. There's like, how do we take this potential and turn it into real cash? And some of that is dependent upon the market and the market dynamics. Obviously, the moments at which equity generally becomes realized are an acquisition or an IPO, typically. The other, broader set of opportunities for some realization of actual liquidity might be secondary transactions, but those are really quite rare for even most startups in the States. Those aren't real opportunities for a lot of employees, and employees, to be honest, get very little say in whether or not those opportunities are even going to be afforded to them. It's really up to the founders if that's the way they want to run their company. So you don't have a lot of choice is basically what I'm trying to say when it comes to the employee side, which is why I think, and this is again maybe a bit of a tangent to the original question, but there's a a tendency amongst equity holding people to think about equity as though it is cash. And it is not cash. It is definitely not cash. There are hoops to you actually acquiring that stock, whether it's by the exercise cost, the exercise timing, etc. And there are hoops to you actually turning that stock into real dollars vis-a-vis liquidity events. And neither of those is in some cases in your control. We have great data on what employees are paid in salary and equity, and we encourage employees to negotiate on equity as much as they can. But in their mental models, you don't want to treat this as a cash value. You want to treat it as an upside bet that you're being justly compensated for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, interesting. What are some other ways, like given that we're in this interesting environment where we're seeing like more time between rounds, we're seeing maybe fewer rounds, we're seeing, I think I saw in your data there's a slight uptick from Q1 to Q2 in the funding environment. But what are some novel ways maybe that companies are trying to release liquidity from their ESOP, if at all, or at least trying to maintain relevance of that ESOP program when actually the horizon for liquidity might be further away than it was originally thought?
Some of this comes down to the actual attitudes of the candidates themselves. As I think we've touched on before in a back and forth over email, this climate probably forces a lot of people to negotiate more heavily on the cash side of their offer. They're more focused on the dollars they can see, which I totally understand. Like in a downturn, that's probably actually a smart way to do it. But startups are actually kind of mirroring that back to employees a lot of the time. They are equally concerned about cash and ESOP burn. So some of those offers have gotten less generous in terms of just the total number of shares. However, there are dials you can turn here. So one is early exercise. We are seeing a lot of nascent startups try early exercise, which is basically a tax advantage way for employees that are receiving options, ISOs out of the ESOP to basically exercise them on the date that they're received and start that clock on capital gains taxes a lot earlier. So that's one thing. The other is, and this is, again, you got to, Matt, kick me off these soapboxes if I don't stop talking about them. But the 90-day period to exercise options, I understand why it exists. It exists because there's a legal limit to the amount of time that you can have an ISO, an incentive stock option, sit out there to be exercised. And that legal limit is 3 months, 90 days. And then it converts into an NSO, which isn't amazing and has different tax advantages and disadvantages for the employee. But I just fundamentally believe that if you are leaving your job and you've worked there for 3 years, 90 days isn't enough time to make that choice about your equity. Yeah. It's not enough time because A, you might not have the cash on hand. But I think more importantly, B, it's not enough time because you don't get to see the scope of the business grow. It's like, imagine right now if I left, if we were at a Series A startup, it's going pretty well, but there's a cool job that we want to take and we want to jump to this new opportunity. Wouldn't another year of data on how that company did be very useful in our exercise decision? And don't we, as people who've worked at that company for a few years, deserve that extra time? I know it's a hassle and an administrative headache for a lot of founders, but I just fundamentally believe that employees at startups should have more time to choose to exercise their equity. They've earned it. It's not, they stayed, they vested it, they stayed for the amount of time that you asked them to. Now the company should be fairly generous with how long they have to choose to buy in or not, in my view.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting topic. It's one I'm a little torn on because I did some work recently for a company that had no post-termination exercise period. So you had the full 10-year expiry date of the option to be able to exercise even if you left after the first quarter or first year rather of the cliff. The challenges that presents from your burn rate is hard because you can now suddenly no longer count on someone leaving and those options coming back into the pot to be reissued to inevitably the person that you're hiring. So I see some of the company side of actually we don't really want to make it too long. But then, I'm also a person who's left a company and gone, yeah, you're right. Like 3 months to stump up that kind of cash is nigh on impossible. You're in a period of instability. I mean, you're into a new role. You also have no certainty over how well that's going to go. So you're probably less inclined to spend it. So it's a real challenge. But then, I've also been someone who's had a 12-month post-termination exercise period window, which was a very different experience. But I think the thing for me that felt lacking in that example is actually your ability to understand how the company's going and whether or not, making a bet on whether or not it's still, maybe I've got the cash now, I'm in a period, where I feel more confident that I could invest it, but actually my links back to the company and the monthly all hands and stats on the business, revenue and things like that, I don't have access to that anymore. And so making that decision is more challenging. Maybe there's a product here, but what are some ways that you think?
I think you outlined the challenge very well, and perhaps my stridency at the beginning is a little unfair to founders who do face this difficult question. I'm not necessarily advocating for unlimited post-termination exercise periods. That's really hard, especially as you are facing uncertain hiring needs later on, and the pool is what the pool is. I do think, and this is something we actually do at Carta, we index the post-termination exercise period to your tenure. So the longer you stay at Carta, the longer you have to exercise after you leave. And I think that is a decent alignment. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but to your point, maybe I'm missing out on some, if I leave Carta, maybe I don't have access to how the interior business is doing. But it does relieve some of that acute pressure of a 90-day period. The other thing about the 90 days is that, well, two things. One, when it's not by choice, it's even worse because you didn't have time to save up cash to exercise if you're being laid off, which is a problem. Now, whether or not you are actually excited about exercising options in a company that's laying you off, totally different mental choice. But the second is that in that scenario, we see a lot of founders actually amend the grants. They amend the post-termination exercise period on those grants and extend them to a year is the usual amount. So it's this constant, like, where are we in the culture? Where are we in the flow of the business? That kind of goes back and forth. I don't think 90 days is the right number, but nor do I think I have the perfect amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think, yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think there's fors and against. I think you're right. 90 days probably is too short. Maybe unlimited is too long. There's some middle period there that companies need to, decide on for themselves. And then there's all the other complications that come with it around, do you even bother engaging people who are option holders outside of employment and helping them make an informed decision as to whether or not they should become shareholders and things like that. So
for sure.
It's a challenging topic. I want to switch up a little bit to the role of the head of people. You're one of probably the most well-connected people in terms of like who you're speaking to across startups and things like that. What role do you see that head of people traditionally play when it comes to equity programs? I think much like compensation from my own experience, it's a remit that we share very deeply with the finance team. Yeah. There's very philosophical, cultural aspects to it, and then there's very strong, accounting analysis, etc., that comes with it. What do you see the key three things or main sort of remit of the head of HR in this sort of space?
So I think that the head of people is, as you mentioned, it's sort of like forming this tandem with the finance team. And in my view, the head of people at these early stage startups, and not every early stage company will even have a head of people. Probably we're talking more like A, B range, maybe even a little bit later occasionally, before the HR team really takes on that sort of, concretized version of itself. The first responsibility is just setting the actual compensation philosophy in addition to finance. So again, you've decided you're going to offer equity as part of the package. Fantastic. Are you the kind of place that offers 75th percentile equity to specific roles because you need to hire them? Is it everyone is at a certain level? How do you think about the burn? Where are we going? It's like very deeply tied into your hiring plans for the next year or two. So like that is a core role that the head of people plays in establishing the compensation philosophy of the company. Obviously then adjusting over time as new data comes in, as hiring needs fall away or exceed what you expected, et cetera. The second is the head of people is often, though, again, I would push many founders to be more involved here, the chief communicator of equity to the company. And that communications role takes on both a tactical valence, where you're talking about here's where it will live, here's how it works, here's how you would exercise it, questions about taxes, are you writing them to the right person, or routing them to the right person, but also the strategic. Here's what it means for us as a business. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what we think it means for you as owners, not just employees. So I think that those two roles as like compensation philosophy on the one end and then chief communicator of equity on the other are core roles that there are very few other people at the company that could really play those roles outside of whoever's leading the people function.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. I like that. And again, seeing many examples across the industry, who's doing it right when it comes to communication? Who's kind of setting the standard, do you think, when it comes to really, we talked about the education piece, we talked about, there's obviously a company update piece too. Okay, well, what could your options be worth now? What do we hope they will be worth in a year or 10 years? Who's doing that really well?
I know of a couple of folks that are fantastic at this. I believe she actually left her role at Rippling recently, but Christine Maxwell at Rippling is an amazing communicator around these subjects. I won't toot our own horn at Carta too much, but of course we live and breathe equity, so our equity education is pretty advanced here. You get a 201 level PhD in equity when you join. I think you touched on an interesting idea, which is the like scenario modeling. What could this be worth in the future? I think it's funny, when you talk to employees at startups, they probably say, look, we kind of got that during the candidate pitch, and then it never really came up again, right? Like, you kind of sold it on us on like, look at our growth and look where we're headed. And then when we got into the company, it was like, we're kind of left with reading through some Google Docs on what this stuff is. So I think that a lot of companies, and it's one priority amongst hundreds, can do a little bit more of keeping their current employees informed about, both material changes to their equity. So did the 409A change, et cetera, or also just, hey, as we grow, here's what this means for you. sometimes it's just good news that's not even communicated exactly correctly. So I do feel as though a lot of the talk about equity is focused on the candidate process. And once someone signs, it kind of falls away.
Yeah, I see that a lot from a cash compensation perspective as well. I think a lot of time is spent, working out what the number needs to be to get people in the door, and then maybe can occasionally fall away when it comes to that ongoing practice. What are sort of one or two things in a startup where there is so much to communicate to people? I think it's too easy to overwhelm them, and I've been overwhelmed before as an employee with many different things, company updates. What feels like the right cadence? What feels like the right amount of info? You mentioned prominent updates. How do we make sure that this sort of thing is something that is still performing its role as an incentive, but isn't overwhelming and just kind of being ignored because of how much other content there is out there?
I don't think this is like a monthly update. I'm not even sure it's a quarterly. I think probably twice a year or at least annually, talking about equity, talking about how, for instance, if the business is growing, going through those funding rounds, what the changes in those funding have meant. So, by the way, your employees are reading, if you raise a new round of funding, hopefully they're not reading about that in TechCrunch. Hopefully you let them know. You can't let them know too early. I understand that. You have to sign the deals first, but then have a little sit down and say, hey, we raised a Series B for this much from these people to accomplish this goal. Here's what it means for our growth. Here's what it means for our future. Here's what it means a little bit for your equity. I think that's a great way to parcel it in there. And again, a lot of these updates are actually good news, or can be good news, or at least they're going to be like appreciated by the employee who's gaining a little bit more transparency. But it can be tough to remember to do them in the rigmarole of everything startups.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Sticking a little bit with the head of people role, what are some of the skills that you think are really incumbent upon the ability to crucially deliver in those two key areas that you mentioned? So there's the philosophy side of things, which can be a very facilitative but also very analytical thing. But then there's also the communicator. What do you think are some skills that maybe people need to put at the forefront to deliver those well?
It certainly starts on a foundation of analytics. I think that maybe there's some sense around the business world that a head of people is a less analytical role. I think that couldn't be further from the truth. I think that the best heads of people are deep in the numbers and understand why they're changing. A simple example here, one of the biggest questions that we've seen head of people wrestle with lately in the last, call it 3 years or so, is how do I compensate across a country or across the globe? Am I calculating an individual compensation band for every single city that I hire in? Am I trying to tier those cities into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities and paying those according to a single rubric? And then how am I explaining that either remote work or hybrid work or whatever philosophy to the company as a whole? That's an analytical exercise. You got to think about the way those cities might change over time. You got to think about where they are now. You got to think about, does the talent base that you're looking for live in specific areas? It's a complex exercise. Someone who has no grasp of numbers isn't going to be a great fit for that. So that's first and foremost. And then on the communication side, there is a, how do I put this? There is a tendency sometimes to talk about comp in a very sterile way, where it feels a bit boring, because you want to make sure you're getting the legalese in the right place. And I empathize with heads of people here who say, Peter, you can't castigate me for that. I'm required to do it that way by X, Y, or Z laws or regulations, or even just fears from the E-team. There's an advantage if you can make it personal, right? So if you can talk about why you made decisions around compensation in a personal way, or at least in a vernacular that these employees are listening. So you're not using so many equity terms that it goes over everybody's head and you're kind of left with more questions than you had at the beginning. Finding the right style of communication can be as important as the content.
Yeah, I think to your point around having founders be involved in that communication piece, that's where they can be so impactful, because if they can carry through that passion for the business and what the opportunity is, I think that's such an infectious and incentivizing means through which to actually drive effectiveness of your equity program, is having someone like really, rile people up about, the prospect and where it can go, and how we're going along the journey as well. Like, yeah, we kicked, these goals, out of the park. Here's what it's meant for us, and here's what it means for you. Here's what it means for when we eventually IPO or whatever.
And doubling down on that is even more true in the down moments, where, speaking of the startups writ large at the moment, there have been a lot of down rounds in U.S. startups over the last year. Something like, I don't know, 20 to 25% of every round on Carta over the last 18 months has been a down round, which means the company's worth less than they were before. Those are challenging moments. Your employees are asking questions. Whether or not they are going to voice them to you as leadership is one thing, but they are asking questions of each other, of their families, of whatever. It's like, what does this mean for my equity? Am I underwater? What's the growth path in this company, et cetera? Like, you don't want to leave those questions just lingering. You can't potentially answer all of them in the way that you want to, but you need to have a narrative around, look, yes, we got out over our skis in valuation, but here's where the business is now. Here's where the business is going. Here's why we think your equity is still a valuable retention mechanism. Those are all things that I think ideally, as you mentioned, come from the founder, but the head of people has to be involved in those conversations.
Huge trust builder as well. I think, like, if you can be really upfront with your people and say, look, this is the environment, this is where we're at, here's what it means, people see that and go, yeah, cool. I appreciate you not trying to, dress turkey or whatever the saying is, but it's, you're just being upfront with the company.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is an advantage to transparency. It can feel very scary, but I completely agree with you.
Something else you said that I find really interesting is around the analytical piece of the head of HR, the head of people role, and in particularly in that global context. How do you often see heads of people maybe differentiate the philosophy around like cash compensation and ESOP compensation? So, for example, in a previous role that I was in, we had 70 countries. We tackled cash in a very different way to the way that we tackled equity. And in fact, I remember seeing this again in another one of your very insightful, data insight dumps, but that the larger companies tend not to have distinctions based on geography when it comes to cash. So at Oyster, we did distinguish geographically based on cash, but we didn't when it came to ESOP. So if you were in the US, if you were in Australia, if you were in Africa, you got the same amount if you were at that role of the company, because we felt that the value you're generating for the company and should therefore realize potentially is similar. How do you see companies tackle that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you were at a fairly generous place if I'm putting that company in the whole spectrum of companies there. In speaking in generalities here, the cost of labor is the number one input into the compensation matrix that other databases like Carta or other people are considering. Like, it can feel very annoying to employees that cost of living is not what matters, but it isn't when it comes to these compensation matrices. It is cost of labor. So if you are hiring an engineer in San Francisco versus hiring an engineer in Charlotte or Boise, just to use the US as an example, you are going to pay that person differently. What we have seen is two things. One, for a while, I think, especially before the pandemic, people had done this more on a city-by-city basis, and now it's much more on a tiers basis. And the reason for that is they probably are just managing a lot of employees in places that they probably hadn't expected to manage them before. We can maybe leave the debate about return to office on one side, because that can get toxic. And then the second thing is we have seen a bit of a convergence between whatever discount or relative factor you're using for salary. You tend to use the same one for equity, maybe a little bit less depending on who you are and what stage of company you are. The other important point is the market is much more national the higher up you're hiring. So if you are hiring a C-suite executive at a Series B company, the fact that that C-suite executive is in Dallas is going to be a much less important factor than the fact that they are going to be the CMO. You really, the pay market is nationalized at some point when you head up towards the leadership ranks.
Yeah, really, yeah, good considerations. And again, speaking to some of the key differences there. We're kind of drawing to a close here. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, with all of the data at your disposal, what's a prediction that you would make? What's some things you're seeing crop up, or maybe you're just going to, you're not, and you're going to go out and make a total ballpark, pitch for something you think is going to happen. But yeah, what's one thing you think is going to happen, you're predicting is going to happen?
Oh, wow. Look, the biggest trend in compensation, which I'm remiss I have not mentioned earlier, is hiring. Comp follows from demand, which is hiring. Startups have, by and large, really, really turned down their hiring over the last year. So you can put some numbers on that. 2022, companies on Carta hired 500,000 new employees. Huge growth. 2023, companies on Carta hired 260,000. So cut in half, effectively. And when you compare that to the people who left, mostly with, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, you're talking about companies on Carta basically treading water in terms of total headcount over the last year on an aggregate basis. There are many companies who are growing fast and some that are doing poorly. So when you look across like trends and predictions around comp or equity, the number one input to those things is, when do you think hiring is going to come back? Or, put a little bit more dismally, do you think hiring is going to come back? I do, personally. I think it's actually pretty rare that as human beings, when the spigots of cash come back on, you're not going to try to hire some more people. I think that's the biggest thing, is the fundraising input. But I will say the kind of hiring, I think, is going to be different. So we've seen a rise in fractional roles. We've seen a rise in offshoring whole departments. There's a beginning nascent move to, can you automate a lot of this, and maybe where you would have had 10 customer service reps, now you have 3, and they're automated through AI or assisted through AI, et cetera. All of those things are happening. I'm really fascinated by, a prediction that I would have for 2025 is that hiring at startups is going to improve, but the kinds of hires are going to be different. So your biggest teams used to be sales, customer success, support, et cetera. Maybe those aren't the biggest teams at the company anymore. Now you're like more heavily skewed towards technical roles, or you're more heavily skewed. I should have said engineers is usually the biggest place at a company, but more technical roles, more like sort of people teaching machines to automate various processes. And once it's automated, they move on to the next thing. Like, I'm just interested to see like what the shape of hiring is for young companies when it pops back.
Yeah, it's a really good point, is that I think there will be some return. I agree with you there, but it's like the downturn in talent or in the economy in some respects and startups has coincided with this massive explosion of AI, and seeing how that's going to augment the workforce will be really interesting. I think everyone thinks and knows that we're just kind of at the tip of the iceberg there. So seeing where we go is it's going to be an insightful future. Peter, this has been amazing. Thanks so much for jumping in. It's everything I expected and hoped. So thank you for joining us. And no doubt there's a recap in 12 months' time to see whether or not your prediction came true.
Absolutely. I love to be held to my predictions. So happy to join back and see how I did.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Foundation Series. Make sure to head over to our website to subscribe to the Foundation Series for monthly editions featuring future interviews on startup compensation. In each edition, we'll explore the different strategies, trends, and challenges faced by startups around the world. If you have a burning topic you'd like me to cover, or a standout guest that you want to hear from, drop me an email so I can dive deeper into the compensation topics that matter most to you. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the strategies and practices driving success in global tech startups around the world. Thanks for listening.